Before we begin today's video, I wanted to remind everyone I'm on Ko-fi now. I've stopped using Buy Me a Coffee. Instead, I'm using this new site, Ko-fi, which is more reliable. You can support me there by donating a few dollars or by buying things from my online shop, such as tuitions for history, literature and language, or notes, flashcards for loads of subjects, which are very useful, and they're the same flashcards I used for my own iGCSEs. You can also find my own iGCSE exemplar answers there, even for English literature, which is right now only for $5.5. So if you want, you can grab that because it's a great resource, which I'm sure will help you guys quite a lot. So yeah, this is just a quick reminder before we begin the video. You guys can support me over on Ko-fi now instead of Buy Me a Coffee. Welcome to another video on my channel. This one is a highly requested one because many of you asked me in the comments to make a video specifically on how to answer unseen poems for English literature. So here it is for all of you who requested it. So before we get into the actual answering of the poem, I wanted to look at what is actually going to be assessed when the examiner is going through your answers. So when the examiner is going through your answer, they're going to be looking for AO2 or Assessment Objective 2, and that is the main focus for unseen poetry. It is the only assessment objective that is assessed for unseen poetry. So as you can see from here, AO2 means that you as a student have to analyze the language, form and structure used by a writer to create meanings and effects, and it constitutes 40% of the entire iGCSE. Of course, AO2 is also assessed in other parts of your English literature exam, such as inspector calls, etc. Now for unseen poem, the main thing you need to focus on is obviously going to be language, form and structure, which is written over here in the cutout. But not only that, but you have to also focus on meanings and effects. So not just language, form and structure, but also the meanings and their effects that they have on the readers. This is very important. Now don't get confused thinking, what language, form, structure, how do I know what is what, and how do I know where to find it in a poem? So don't worry, we're going to address all of that. First of all, let's look at what they mean by language. So when it says language over there in the AO2 cutout, it means basically important literary devices. So if you have not heard of figurative devices, then that's pretty bad, but I'm sure most of you have. Figurative devices are used by writers and authors and poets to enhance the way they describe things, to emphasize things, to be less literal and more figurative. Okay, so important literary devices that you should know include alliteration. So alliteration is when a consonant letter is repeated in a single sentence or in a paragraph. So like over here, gently in glimmering green grass, that is a repetition of the consonant letter G. So that's alliteration. Alliteration is used a lot in poetry. So the literary devices which you're going to see here are those that are the most commonly found in poems, and of course there are many literary devices. There's so many that I cannot list them all at once. So of course these are not all of them, these are just the important ones as it says in the title. So alliteration, number one. Then there is hyperbole or hyperbole, I don't know how you pronounce it. This is the worst food in the world. So basically this is an exaggeration. It's not exactly true. When you say that this is the worst food in the world, it's not literally the worst food in the world, but it's a way of exaggerating the intensity to which you dislike the food. Next, we have imagery. So imagery is a way of describing things in a very visual manner, which helps the readers to imagine what you're trying to say better. So imagery can be visual imagery, sound imagery, sensory imagery, as in feeling, like as soft as silk, so that would be sensory imagery. And there's lots of types of imagery, the most common being visual imagery. So over here, this is an example from Romeo and Juliet. The brightness of her cheek would shame those stars. So basically this is visual imagery where you can see that Shakespeare is comparing Juliet's cheek to stars, and it's a more interesting way to describe things rather than saying that, you know, her cheek was very bright. So imagery is also found a lot in poems. Then there's repetition. I have a dream in Martin Luther King's speech. So that is an example of repetition when things are repeated quite a lot. And I don't think I need to explain what repetition is. It's quite evident from the name itself. Then we have simile. So simile is another very well-known literary device. It's when you compare something using the words like or as. So as you can see in this example, she ran like the wind. So this is a simile because the author is comparing her running to the wind using the word like over here. You can also use the word as. So she ran as fast as a cheetah. So that would also be a simile. Now some more literary devices because there are many of them, but I promise you just some more, and then we're going to go straight into answering the unseen poem. Euphemism, passed away instead of died. So euphemism is a way of toning down the potency of something. So instead of directly saying she died, we use she passed away, or she has gone, or she's not here anymore. So that's euphemism. Then there is paradox, which is a contradicting statement which is actually true in a way. So this is the beginning of the end. Now this is a contradictory statement in which we have contradictory words. Beginning and end are two contradictory words, and but still the sentence makes sense and is perfectly true because the end also has a beginning. So this is the beginning of the end. That's a paradox. Then you have personification, another very common literary device. The clouds swam in the sky. So personification is basically giving a human attribute or something that humans do to non-living things like animals and clouds. So over here, the human action of swimming is given to the clouds. So the clouds swam in the sky. So that's personification. So I hope you understand that. Now, next we have metaphor, another very common one. So it is similar to a simile, but you do not use the word like or as. So as you saw in a simile, we said she ran like the wind, but instead you would probably say something like she was the wind for a metaphor. So that would be a metaphor if you said she was the wind, because it implies the same thing. It implies that she's very fast, very quick, but you don't use the words like and as. So that's a metaphor. And another example here, time is a thief. Once again, it's a comparison between two things. Okay, next we have onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is basically words that sound very similar to the actual sound. So you have tick-tock, which sounds very much like the real ticking of the clock, and then there would be crash. So crash also sounds very similar to the actual sound of something crashing. Then boom and twitter of birds, etc. Okay, last one I'm going to mention is oxymoron. It's not very common, but it's something you still should know. Oxymoron is when you use two opposite words together, but they are making sense. So she's pretty ugly. Pretty ugly are two very opposite words, but in this way, it doesn't actually mean she's pretty and ugly. It means she's very ugly. So she's pretty ugly. Or he was acting naturally. So, of course, acting and being natural are two different things, but they're used together in this case, and it makes perfect sense. He was acting naturally. So this thing is called an oxymoron, and there are many other examples as well, such as real imagination, etc. Okay, so now that we are done looking at important literary devices and understanding what is meant by language, we can move on to form. So hopefully now you guys know that when they mean language, they mean that you have to find important literary devices within the poem and pick them out and find out how they're significant, what effect they create on you as a reader. So this is what is meant by language. Now, by form, they mean something else, obviously, and it is very similar to structure, but there are certain things which are included in form that are not part of structure. So for example, let's look at what is included in form. So first of all, the type of poem. Is it a sonnet, a free verse poem, or a lyrical poem, etc.? So there are many types of poems, and I'm not going to go into that in this video. If you want, you can look it up online. There are many sites which tell you what types of poems there are, and I'm sure you'll get it if you search it up online. So there are many types of poems, so that is included in form. When you are writing an answer to an unseen poem, you have to mention what type of poem it is, and this comes under form. Then you have the pace of the poem. Is it a fast moving poem? Is it slow? Are there lots of breaks in the poem or not? Then there's rhyme scheme. So do the lines rhyme? Do they rhyme consistently, alternatively? Is it an AABB scheme or a CABC? I don't know, I just made that one up. So you have to identify the rhyme scheme, see if there is one. If there isn't, it's probably a free verse poem. And then obviously this comes under form. Last thing that comes under form is narrative voice. Now narrative voice is very important because depending on what the poem is about, narrative voice can mean a lot. So there are 3 types of narrative voice: first person, second person, third person, and I'm sure all of you know what they are, but you probably don't know their significance. So the first person is usually used when you want the poem to be more engaging and want the person to realize your personal feelings about the matter. So if it is written in first person, it usually tends to be more personal and more engaging. Now if it's in second person, it feels like you're being talked to, like a conversation, like someone is telling you things if it is in second person, because you is used quite a lot, and it feels like someone is talking to you and telling you things, so it feels like a speech that someone is giving, for example. Then we have third person, which is he, she, they, the very common narrative voice which is used in most novels as well. So third person is the least personal. Obviously it's from another person's point of view, and the most significant thing about third person narrative voice is that you get a lot of detail. So in third person poems usually have more detail than if it would be a first person or second person narrative voice, but of course it depends on the type of poem and what the poem is about. So yeah, this is what is included in form. So when they say you have to comment on the language and form, now you know what you have to comment on. So let's just move on to the structure and what is included in the structure of a poem. So first of all, contrast between ideas, words, phrases, concepts, etc. So any type of contrast within a poem is considered part of structure. So if in the beginning of a poem it talks about a girl's childhood and then towards the end she grows up into an adult, this is a contrast between 2 different times of her life, how she was when she was young and how she was in her adulthood. Now if she was the same as a child and as an adult, there's not much of a contrast, but obviously there's going to be a change, and that change is a contrast between her 2 types of 2 phases of life. Then there's contrast between words. So words in one half of the poem could be very positive, and in the other half they could be very negative. So if you're able to spot that and say, oh, there's a contrast between the type of words and adjectives used in the first half of the poem and the second half of the poem, if you're able to point that out, then that comes under structure and you'll get a point, a mark for that. Okay, next you have repetition. So repetition, we mentioned it before. Repetition is a literary device and it comes under language as well as structure. So repetition of words, of whole phrases, it comes under structure. Then there is sentence lengths. So are the sentences short? Are they long? Are they winding in the sense that do they run on? So do they end? Do they have full stops, or do they have commas, or do they have no punctuation? All of this comes under the structure of a poem, and everything has its own significance. So if there are short sentences, it could suggest panic. Usually in panicked moments, people speak in shorter words. Or it could mean that the poet has a fragmented state of mind in which she or he is speaking very, short and concisely. So it depends. And if there are longer sentences, then of course it could imply loads of things, like maybe the quick changing pace of her life, or maybe if it's something about an athlete and there are long winding sentences, it could suggest the way the athlete is used to quick moving and doing things fast. There are lots of things, and it obviously all depends on the type of poem that you get. So yeah, sentence length is part of structure. Then lastly, we have enjambment. Enjambment means, do lines have endings or do they run on? So I mistakenly included this in the previous point. Right now, if you just rewind, you can hear me talking about do they have commas, do they break, or do they run on. So this actually comes under enjambment. If sentences run on, meaning that if one single sentence spans over several lines and then finally ends at one stanza, so if one whole stanza is one sentence, then that's enjambment, because the whole sentence is just running on without any full stops. So that is enjambment, and that comes under structure. Okay, so now we know what comes under language, form, and structure. Under language, literary devices; under form, a number of things, most importantly narrative voice. Then under structure, one of the most important is contrast and sentence length. So now we know what comes under these three. Now we know that when we get a question on an unseen poem, we have to focus on these three things: picking out language, form, and structure from the poem and linking it back to the question. Okay, so now that we're done understanding that, let's look at how you answer the poem. Okay, so to properly show you how to answer an unseen poem, I've come to my Notion page over here where I made some notes on how to answer unseen poetry. Now, before we begin, I have to give credit to Mr. Sal's Teaches English, which is a great YouTube channel where I got most of these ideas from. This is what I got from his videos basically, and none of this is originally my own, but since so many of you wanted to know how to answer a poem, I thought I would still give you these tips, even though they're mostly from his channel. Of course, I've added things here and there. So yeah, responding to unseen poems, key points to include when writing an answer. So the first thing you need to talk about when you start writing your answer is the beginning of the poem. So read the poem 2 or 3 times to give yourself the maximum chance to understand it and hear it in your head. Simply notice the impression it makes on you. So the first time you read the poem, you might not get it. That's why you should read it more than one time and notice what impression it makes in you. What do you feel when you read it? What stands out? Underline anything that stands out for you, and especially focus on the beginning of the poem and what you think is significant in that. Explore the first few lines of the poem and infer the poet's purpose from this. So when you are going through the beginning of the poem, try to guess what the poet's purpose might be. By guess, I don't mean make something out of your own ideas. By looking at the poem, try to figure out what the poet's purpose is. Is the poet trying to convey a message? Is he trying to prove something? Is he trying to persuade you? Is he trying to entertain you? Is it a story? Is it a reflection, etc.? So the first thing you need to talk about as soon as you start your essay is the beginning of the poem. As soon as you start your essay, just start talking about the beginning of the poem and what is significant about it. Next, mention the title. So now that you've written about the beginning of the poem and what you think is significant about it, as well as the poet's purpose, return to the title and see how this fits with what you have interpreted about the poet's purpose. So like the title of the poem the title of that poem is If, so you would return to the title and comment on the significance of the poet using the word if as the title and what this infers about his purpose of writing the poem. So you would do that when you write your answer. First, mention the beginning of the poem, then go back to the title and link it with your first paragraph. Okay, once you're done with that, you have to focus on soap rims. Okay, so soap rims is basically a mnemonic for literary devices that are the most commonly found in poems. So we've already discussed all of these, and this is just a mnemonic to help you remember them when it's time for you to write your essay. So S for simile, O onomatopoeia, A alliteration, P personification, R repetition, I imagery, M metaphor, and S sentence structure. So I know sentence structure comes under structure, but it's still there because most people tend to forget sentence structure, so it's good to remember it as part of this mnemonic as well. That way you won't tend to miss it out. Okay, so just remember soap rims, simile, onomatopoeia, alliteration, personification, repetition, imagery, metaphor, and sentence structure. These are the main literary devices that you have to find in the poem and comment on. Now, just don't comment on the literary devices in the sense that don't just say that, oh, there are 3 similes here and this word is an onomatopoeic word, etc., and alliteration of this phrase. No, you don't have to feature spot, so don't go around spotting features. You have to mention the effect that they have, their meaning, and the effect that they have on you as a reader, and why this links with the poet's purpose. So, for example, you find a simile like she runs like the wind. So now don't just say there is a simile used, she runs like the wind. Instead, say that, this implies that the poet is trying to show her as a very speedy or athletic person, and this links to the poet's purpose of showing her as someone very agile when she was young, etc., etc. So this is just an idea off the top of my head, and this is how you basically have to write your answer. Always mention the effect that it has. Don't just spot the feature and write the feature. Okay, so basically, after the beginning and the title, you should have a couple of good paragraphs on soaprims. All of this should not be in one paragraph, it should be in separate paragraphs. And the main thing is that you should have your focus on these literary devices and not forget to mention them. Okay, then you need to mention structure and form. We already talked about this. Structure and form and all that is included in it is already mentioned. So I'm just going to say that just look at the form or structure of the poem and show how this helps you interpret the poet's purpose. Don't write anything about what it looks like visually on the page, because that might be gibberish. So just don't write what it will look like on the page, because many people tend to write about, the lines look like it is shaped like a baby, so this signifies that the poem is about a baby and stuff. Don't do that, because it's really gibberish, and at the end of the day it will not earn you any marks. Okay, so don't write about that. Focus on form and structure and the things that are included in it, like contrast, narrative voice, repetition, sentence structure, and so on. Once you've written about structure and form of the poem, go back to the ending of the poem. So look at the ending of the poem where the poet's purpose might have changed slightly. Interpret what this change is. If there isn't a change, signify why so. So now that you have written everything else, go back to the poem, read the ending, and see how it is different from the beginning of the poem. If it is different, comment on why it's different. If it's not different, then comment on why it's not different. And basically, when you're ending your essay, write about the ending of the poem. So it's fairly simple to remember, and this is basically your structure, ideal structure for responding to an unseen poem: beginning, title, soaprims, structure and form, and then the ending of the poem. And this is very easy to remember, especially during the exam time. You quickly just bring this structure back to your head and just immediately start writing about the beginning of the poem, and then automatically you'll see your ideas will flow and you'll be able to write much better. And this is the same formula that I used for my iGCSE exam as well when I was responding to my unseen poem, and it helped quite a lot because I had a fixed structure in my mind and I didn't have to scramble around for like, oh, okay, what do I write about next, and oh, did I miss out structure, did I miss out mentioning the title, or what about the ending, and so on. So you don't get into that muddle. Instead, you have this clear structure. Now, one last thing I wanted to mention before we end this video is that you have to remember the importance of the question. So if the question is about showing how the writer portrays animals in the poem, please just focus on the animals in the poem and don't start talking about other things that are mentioned which may not be related to the question. So if the question, for example, is about how the writer presents the theme of generosity or the theme of old age, just focus on the keyword of the question and don't digress from that, because by doing that you will lose the focus on the main thing that is in the question, and therefore that will result in lesser marks. So if it's about the theme of old age, look for points that are related to the theme of old age in the poem, and whatever point you make, link it back to the theme of old age, and this way you'll get better marks, because the examiner will understand that this student knows the focus of the question and they're answering according to that, and they're not just summarizing the poem. Okay, so that was that. That was my way of answering unseen poems, and I hope this is useful for you guys as well. Thank you for watching.